I was thinking, Ellen, since we've sort of, heard what I found a very interesting lecture from Jennifer, and I saw quite a few similarities, amongst the pictures, amongst the ideas of how do we plan, the sort of ways of implementing it. And Ellen has said that what the two dimensions of urban planning is now is more about visions and mobilization, and it's about regimes of fulfillment. So how do you create those partnerships that you described and actually making them work? So I would really love to challenge you actually, to comment a bit on Jennifer's talk, what you found interesting and what you find kind of applies to a Norwegian context.
I think I first would like to say, when I listen to you here or in Vienna or on TED Talks or whatever, I think your value-based approach is so inspiring. And the fact that you say that individual actions or actions of individuals matters, and also that you have to engage people and you have to make an arena for all the partners to understand. I think that's very sort of inspiring to listen to. Of course, I think a lot of the cities do a lot of what you do, but you do it very structurally, and that's very impressive. I'd like to mention just a small example. The other day, we have Sørenga, which is a very popular sort of swimming place by the sea, and it's been very popular. But we have a small area that is supposed to be for handicapped people, and it was growing over with weeds, and it was closed down. And then a chap from Tønsberg, it's an hour drive away, got some friends together and came to Sørenga and started cleaning the weeds himself. And then 2 days after, my colleague, the director of the Environment and Transport Department, said, we'll do it every day. Individual actions actually matter. Yes.
Yeah.
I could continue a bit.
Oh, you could, but and you will. I'll just drop in a little question, because you mentioned Sørenga, and that sort of adds up to some of these slides that you showed. And what puzzles me is that Sørenga is one of these. Actually, Ola Elvestuen showed one picture in the beginning of it. The last image that he showed, there's a public beach and the end of it. And that is a housing project, kind of a mixed use, but it's mostly housing, and it's really publicly, everyone's using that beach. Then we have another park, which is like the ones you showed, that is being built over a highway at Skøyen, which is definitely more of a private area. So I was wondering, could you elaborate a bit on that? How to make these areas public? How is it really, how do you ensure that they become public and not, the NIMBY, not in my backyard sort of attitude? It goes to you both, actually, but let's, Jennifer, have it first one.
Sure. I think it's interesting. That's why, on the one hand, you can talk about the objectives of what you're seeking to achieve, which matters, the vision, what you want to happen in an area. And then you have the detailed design. And the detailed design is where the vision materializes. So how you design the park will determine whether or not it's perceived to be or experienced as a public space. And we have a lot of places in Toronto now that are actually privately owned, but they read in your experience of the city like public space. And one of the things that I did as chief planner is we created guidelines, design guidelines for these POPs, privately owned public spaces. And the idea is we negotiate with a private developer that a space associated with their project, they're going to own it, they're going to maintain it, but it will be designed in such a way that it's experienced by the public as public space, and the public has no idea that it's privately owned. And the only difference between the public experiencing that space as part of the public realm and the public not experiencing it as part of the public realm is design, It's the detailed design. It's the way it's designed in the fabric of the city. Is there a continuous public round? Are there barriers? Are there fences? Are there paths? Are there places to seat? It comes down to the detailed design. And really, what became clear to us as a municipality, we were always looking for ways to generate more public space. Land is very expensive, and it became clear to us that we could capitalize on the land owned by the private sector simply through design. And so these POP design guidelines, publicly accessible private space, really, most public don't even really know about it. All they know is that there's a wonderful bench to sit on or a wonderful parquet that they can go into. Happens to be owned privately and maintained privately, but they experience it publicly, and it's just design.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Is that how it is in Oslo as well?
As an architect, I love hearing what you're saying. I would like to sort of expand a bit on when I say that it's not anymore about strategic plans and detailed plans, but it's about visions and mobilization, and then on the other dimension, implementation. For instance, mobilizing people to participate in actually making the vision a reality, sort of step by step. In Oslo next year, when we're doing the European Green Capital celebration, we will also talk about what we call the City Hive B-Cube, and this innovation center we made, which of course has to do with how do you actually get the green shift embedded in everybody's brains and enthusiasm and so on. In a way, by doing that, although you shouldn't go for low quality design, going for design that can actually alter over time, and that is not all park standard. It could be everyday standard, and it could be something that you change in 2 years and so on. I think that's a dimension that I, as an architect, and we as planners perhaps need to explore a bit more.
This was one really for you, Ellen, and it might backfire on my department as well, so I'm sort of just closing that door. But it has to do with when you build denser and you build with higher quality, even in the details, and it becomes really popular. At least in Norway, the price tends to increase, and as you said, housing is a commodity. And how we've got our housing market is really like a private run market, saying that most people own their own houses, so it's not really a great market for renting, which is slightly different from other Nordic countries. But given that we've got that system, and we've got some legislations for it and so on, and we've got private entrepreneurs building, and we've got the public authorities lining up with, the details in the public sphere in between the houses. So how to prevent that young people like the millennium generation. Actually, there was one report now saying that 7 out of 10 Norwegian youngsters, if you could say that, in that generation, cannot afford to buy their own house without the parents helping them. And that is a significant number. If you go by preferences, they could, of course, afford some houses far ahead, but not in the cities. So how to work with that in the scale of Oslo, for instance?
That's a very good question, and I'd like to sort of put some words on that. Perhaps Jennifer could help us. Our deputy mayor of urbanism, Hanna Markussen, is presently exploring some of the mechanisms one could use. But I think if we look at other cities, other countries, one often says that planned created values should be divided 2/3 to the community and 1/3 to the developers. And the other countries, Denmark or England and so on, I think, they then require the developers to actually provide a certain section of the projects they are developing as cheap housing. And in Norway, we've talked about this for 2 or 3 or 4 decades, but we don't manage to actually do it. So I would like to ask Jennifer, how do you make the administration and the politicians actually have the strength to carry it out?
So, not an easy question, but a few things. And I could actually talk about this question for hours. The first part is that in the precinct that I showed you, the very first example of precinct planning, in that plan we required that a third of the overall development be affordable housing in the precinct. And I do think you need government regulation and you need government policy because it's not going to happen by accident. It will only happen by design. This was a challenge that plagued me as chief planner, and it plagued me so much that when I moved on from being chief planner, this is actually what I decided to tackle because I saw it as being the biggest threat to cities, successful cities on a global scale, that once we get the planning right and we get the design right and we're investing in the public realm and we're creating these walkable, livable places, they start to become exclusive. And the risk is if they become exclusive, then they do just become playgrounds for the rich and there's an entire generation that gets left out. There's a raging debate in the Canadian context right now as well because our housing is primarily owned. And the assumption is that you will own a house. And owning a house is seen as being stable or being financially successful. When you're young, your aspiration is to own a house. And in fact, what I'm trying to do in my work is to recalibrate that towards recognizing that home ownership is a model that is not going to house everyone and is going to continue to lead to a tremendous amount of exclusion in our cities. And that the only way that we can ensure that we're delivering cities where everyone has the option of being a part of that city, whether you're a teacher or a bus driver or a janitor or an administrative assistant, the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we're creating really high quality, affordable rental that is fully integrated into complete communities. And so that's what we're doing at Creative Housing. We're actually building high quality, affordable rental projects on transit. They're all very green, the highest environmental standards with district energy, passive house. The objective is to ensure that we deliver rental housing that really becomes a first choice. Because what's really became clear in the Canadian context is that people aspire to home ownership in many instances because it's better housing. You get to live in a better neighborhood, you get access to better housing, you have more stability. Well, what happens if we upend that model and instead we provide really high quality, affordable rental that's very stable, that ensures that very coveted 16 to 34-year-old cohort has a place in our cities and knows that there's going to be a place in the city where they can stay, be a part of a community, build their careers or build their livelihood in such a way where they're going to always be able to afford to live there and they're not eventually going to get pushed out. And I do think we need this fundamentally different model. And when I talk about affordable rental, I'm not talking about social housing or subsidized housing. I'm talking about rental that is targeted to the median income.
May I change to another subject?
Okay then, you may.
Because you talk about engaging people, and presently Oslo is in a transition period of making the city centre a more livable and walkable city and removing a lot of the cars. Fortunately, this morning one of the national newspapers, Dialog, wrote a sort of praise to that project, and that's good because we need that. And 3 days ago we closed off one of the major public spaces by the city hall, and it was beautiful to walk there in the evening and see people stepping on summer shoes and lowering their shoulders and looking around. But of course there's a lot of protest. It's a lot, all the commerce, a lot of the people that do enterprise of different kinds in that area say that we are actually ruining the market, and so many shops have closed down and so on. How do you engage them in a better manner?
So I hear your pain. Let me begin with that. I hear your pain. I feel your pain. Because I think that change is very difficult, and there's always going to be certain groups that have a vested interest in the status quo. that they've actually done very well the way things are today. And the drivers for change, the reasons why we ought to change, might not be their key priority. They might not really care about reducing our environmental footprint or our carbon consumption. They might not really care about an equitable city and ensuring everyone has access to the city. They might have a vested interest in oil or in the auto industry. There's a whole variety of reasons why people stand up and aren't interested in participating in change. But I would argue that we can build a vision of the city center. We can build a vision around our shared interests, around what it is that we all want for the future. And really, if you think about it, that's what democracy is really about. Democracy is about saying, you know what, we're all going to come together, we're going to agree to be governed together, because we believe there's certain things that we can provide better if we all come together than we can as individuals. And there's certain things that can create a more progressive society if we do that together. That's really at the heart of democracy. And the challenge, of course, is when we start thinking about our individual interests, because our individual interests often bump up against those shared interests. So I believe a critical part of being able to advance change that is in the shared interest is by having a very robust dialogue about those shared interests. And some of the things that I talked about, the chief planner roundtables, the planners in public spaces, the consultation that we undertook in the City of Toronto was never ending and was on a vast scale, in part because that conversation can never end if we're going to advance progressive change.
Thank you. I thought we had like 4 minutes more, so I'll have to cut us now. I'd really like to drop in some questions about the SDGs and how you're actually implementing those, but I think we'll just do that in the break. The really is not the best thing about having the Crown Prince here, but one of the really great things about having the Crown Prince amongst the audience is that the politicians are also allowed to stay longer than they normally would. So they've really heard you. And with that, we say thank you, and I do hope you run for president. That would be interesting.
Thank you.